to have with us the independent candidate for president of the United States, the Honorable Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And since we at Our Country, Our Choice are about uniting people, we're very anxious to hear from him because he's the only man out there who's talked about uniting us across party lines. Thanks so much for talking to us.
Yeah, I'm very, very excited. Of course, you've been a really good just a counselor to me, an advisor, and I rely on you for so much advice. And you've got such wisdom about so many things, thoughtful, and we share the aspiration of winding down the warfare state and actually making America strong again in the way that countries actually get strong, which was by building an economy and by moral authority, an ability to compete and have our own industrial base. And you're such an important asset to me in formulating the way that I think about these things. So I'm grateful to you. The interesting thing is when I made my announcement in Boston in April, the thing I said I was going to do, and I committed to myself, is to unite this country. You and I have talked about the fact that we're more polarized today probably than any other time since the American Civil War. We saw this kind of polarization in the 1960s too, and people don't recall that there was a lot of violence then. You had cities burning, over 100 cities burning. You had children, kids on campuses, really violent fights and protests, happening all over the country. You had bombings from the party, and so there was a lot of polarization then too. But I have a sense that the polarization today is more dangerous than we've ever seen, probably because of the amplification that it gets from the social media, and that it's being deliberately and purposely amplified by these algorithms that people seem to have completely lost control over. But so my objective was to do what my dad 68, which is to bring people together, and he succeeded during that short campaign. He was only out there for 3 months before he was killed. But the last day of his life, he won the most rural state in our country, which is South Dakota, and he won the most urban state. Together, on the funeral train, we took him from New York. I was with him when he died, Washington, D.C., because we had waked him at St. Patrick's. And that ride was supposed to be 2.5 hours. It turned out to be 7.5 hours because there were 2 million people on the train tracks. Cross section of the American experience. They were whites. There were tens of thousands of Black Americans at Trenton and through those train stations at 1 mile an hour with the windows open. Public, which was the song that they had sung when Lincoln took his last train ride across the country. Trenton and Newark and Philadelphia and in Baltimore, and then in the countryside, there were people in military uniform. There were Boy Scouts standing in salute at attention. There was hippies in tie-dye. There were, I remember seeing Wilmington in a field, an empty field. There was a yellow pickup truck with 7 nuns in the back waving rosaries at us, and they were holding signs up that said, "Goodbye, Bobby, pray for us, Bobby." People holding American flags, and it was this incredible amalgamation of, the entire melting pot of America. And I remember 4 years later, I was at college in Boston and I was studying politics, and I came across polling data that showed almost all of those white people who supported my father and had stood by that train tracks in Baltimore and Pennsylvania and New Jersey during the 1968 election, that 4 years later, they voted not for George McGovern, who was very much aligned politically as and a very, very divisive figure. And it occurred to me, and it struck me many times since, that every individual, like every the hatred and anger and misogyny and racism, etc. Side. And then my father really tried to do something different, which was to get people to take the risk of being part of the community, of saying, we have to avoid the seduction of the notion that ourselves as a nation by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind. And that made people feel kind of a brotherhood or sisterhood with people who had different skin colors. And that takes courage from people, because the easiest thing for you to do, when you're being manipulated by fear, particularly, is to retreat into that tribe press for people, for democratic leaders. They have an instinct for finding that part of the American. So I try to do the same thing. One of the techniques my father did was just to tell the truth to people. And that's reasons for the division today, is that everybody is unsure of what to believe. Because we're being lied to by our government, we're being lied to by the media, all these institutions that we built that were part of the democratic superstructure of our country have now turned predatory against the American people, and they're lying to us. And people need to hear the truth. And that people seek their own, truths, and the places they go are places that will reinforce or validate their existing worldviews and their bigotries and their prejudices. And so I made this commitment, number one, that I'm going to tell the truth to people, and whatever the cause or however impolitic it is. And that also I'm not going to I try to identify the values that hold us all together rather than focus on these issues. They're all important issues: guns, abortion, climate, immigration. Found, Doug, is that there's a much, much larger landscape of commonality. And, you talk to Americans and you begin to understand it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat or white or black. Everybody wants to take care of veterans. Everybody wants to take care of their families and make sure they have good housing and decent food and good health care, particularly from the VA. Everybody wants our children, our education system to be the best in the world. Everyone wants to take care of teachers and to make sure that our kids are in good education, whether they're black or white. Everybody wants that. Everybody wants to end the corrupt merger between state and corporate power. And they want, our regulatory agencies not to be sock puppets for the industries that they're supposed to regulate, but to actually protect the public interest. People want to end the warfare state. Everybody will say that. People will have different ideas about how to do it. And keep America strong, but most people don't want to be in wars. They don't think that's the job of the president, to keep us in constant wars. And they understand that, the role of the intelligence agencies have become captive agencies as well. The Pentagon is a captive agency. The Fed is a captive agency. It serves the interests of Wall Street and the banks, and not what it was created to do, which is to serve, to avoid economic or financial crises and deflation. But it's been captured, and its capacity to print money has now been deployed on behalf of this Wall Street oligarchy and the corporate kleptocracy that is now, into which our democracy has devolved. Everybody wants to protect the environment. If you talk about climate change, you're going to divide people. If that's the only thing you can talk about. But if you talk about habitat protection, if you talk about safeguarding our sacred places, if you talk about ending toxic chemicals that have now permeated our food, our water, our air, everybody wants that. When we did the demonstrations and the protests in Flint, Michigan, we had Hell's Angels standing shoulder to shoulder with urban Black leaders. The same was true at Standing Rock, because we didn't try to sell Standing Rock as a climate issue. We sold it as this is interference with sacred place of this, of the Lakota Indians. And it was amazing the people who showed up for that. You had Republican businessmen and Wall Street people. And you had people from every walk of life in our country, people who never met an Indian before. But they wanted that. And, if you talk about the Appalachian Mountains, about strip mining the Appalachian, enough, the equivalent amount of nitrate explosives. There's three companies, mainly Consol, Peabody, and Massey Coal, that together detonate the equivalent amount of ammonia explosives every day in the Appalachians, the equivalent of a Hiroshima bomb. And they're blowing the tops off the mountains. They've already leveled the 500 biggest mountains in West Virginia. And they flattened an area larger than the state of Delaware. They buried 2,200 miles of rivers and streams. These are the landscapes that, were Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett from. These were the landscapes that, Sergeant Medal of Honor winners and military heroes. They're the landscapes that spawned NASCAR racing and country music and so much of our culture is wrapped up in the Purple Mountain's majesty, and we're cutting them down, and no American wants that. And if you talk about climate, and you try to show people a line on a graph and say the apocalypse is here if you keep what you're doing, we need you to give up your job, pay more for this and that. Nobody wants to do that, and they're not going to convince. But if you show them the Appalachians and you say every freshwater fish in America now has dangerous levels of mercury in its flesh. If you say that, the Appalachians, acid rain has destroyed the forest cover on the high peaks of the Appalachians from Georgia to northern Quebec. People grew up fishing and hunting in the Adirondacks, the oldest protected wilderness on earth. It was a jewel of, American pride in terms of, our identification with the wilderness that democracy came out of that wilderness and made Americans into bred in us this beef jerky toughness that was part of our heritage. And today, and we had a right, because it was the old wilderness on earth, to go there and hunt there and camp there and enjoy it. But today, 1 out of every 5 lakes in the Adirondacks is sterilized from acid rain. And I'm watching I grew up on the coast of New England, and oysters, the quahogs, the clams collapse because the water is now so acidic. The salt water of the ocean can't mobilize calcium out of the water column or shells. Well, nobody wants that. And if you talk about those issues, people respond, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, and say, we need to do something. It's 34. And they asked them if they were proud of the United States of America. And 85% said yes, which to me is almost low. And, it's predictable, right? They did the same poll last month, and 18% of young Americans said they were proud. So we have somehow lost the faith in our country and the administrations of the last two presidents of an entire generation of kids who not only no longer has faith in our country, but they have no hope for their own lives. They're looking at, none of it, they can't afford a house. None of these kids are going to be in a house. And and I know that was just part of the, American promise, the American dream when you and I were growing up. If you worked hard, if you played by the rules, you could finance a home, you could take a summer vacation, you could put something aside for your retirement, you could raise a family on one job.
Yes.
There's nobody in this generation that believes that promise applies to them. We broke it. We have betrayed this generation. And you and I know how it happened. We spent $8 trillion on wars, and since 2001, and $16 trillion on COVID lockdowns, which were just an assault on young people. It was just a war on young people. And they know it, and they feel betrayed. And we have to acknowledge our betrayal of them. And, one of the key elements of my campaign and my central promise is I'm going to put that generation in homes. And that's how, after World War II, at the time you and I grew up, there was a 50-year period we called the Great Prosperity, when the American middle class became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. We owned, when my uncle was president, half the wealth on the face of the earth was American. And we were the